Welcome everybody to Technically Speaking. Today's episode is going to highlight the ANSI IICRC's S500 and cover a method for converting the standard into standard operating procedures. So excited to bring this subject to you. First, let me go ahead and start with the formalities. For those that are new to Technically Speaking, my name is Brandon Burton. I'm the Senior Principal of Industry Relations here at CoreLogic, and I'm also the Chair of the ANSI IICRC Standards. So I oversee the process for the development of the IICRC standards currently. So this particular topic is one that I am particularly passionate about because I spend a lot of time thinking about our industry standards, in particular the IICRC ANSI standards. So this is a process that really kind of sheds some light into some of the work that I like to do behind the scenes as standards are going through development. And I figured I'd start today with just a little bit of a discussion around that and what that looks like, and kind of give you I don't know, kind of the press bulletin on what's happening with standards today as we get into this topic. So let's start off with just a little bit of an industry update on what's happening with standards before I get into using the S500 for standard operating procedures. You may or may not be aware, but there currently is a consensus body, which is the group that works on these standards for ANSI and IICRC, that has just begun the process of revising the S500. You know, it's a 5-year cycle target. We try to make sure that the S500 is updated every 5 years. It was last published in 2021, so we are due for an update in 2026. So there is a consensus body that's currently working on that process. This is something that renews every few years. If you have an interest in participating with these consensus bodies that do this work, I highly encourage that you frequent IICRC.org, go to standards, and just take a look at which standards are currently in revision, which standards are looking for applicants for the consensus bodies, because the IICRC has somewhere in the neighborhood of, it's got to be about 15 or 16 different standards now. And almost always there is one of those standards that's coming into that review cycle. And we love to get volunteers to help us with these revisions. So feel free to fill out those applications. And even if you don't make the consensus body, just by applying, you're added to a volunteer list that will be drawn on by that consensus body for specific areas of interest in the document as it's revised. So the S500 specifically, there were, I believe, 50 applicants. There were 16, I believe, that made the consensus body, and the balance of those applicants at some point through the revision will all be contacted in one way or another to help with that revision process. So volunteer, put your time back into the industry with standards. It is greatly, greatly appreciated. The other real quick newsworthy item before I jump into today's webinar, another area where standards are being developed that you may not necessarily be aware is the S500 standard for structure, fire, and smoke restoration, and the S760 for wildfire assessment, investigation, and restoration. Those both are in their public review cycles. They're getting very, very close to being published. In our industry, for the first time, we'll actually have standards in and around the subject of fire and smoke restoration. If you're not aware of those and you haven't been paying attention to those, they're both going back into what we call a second round of public review, meaning you have the opportunity to download the draft, read the draft, and then provide comments back to the consensus bodies as they work towards their final draft. So that second round of public comment on the S700, I believe, is going to open back up. If it hasn't already, it's going to open back up in the next week or so. If you want to keep a pulse on that, again, IICRC.org, click on the option for standards, and you'll see the status for all of the various ANSI IICRC standards. So anyway, that's my news update for you for the week as it relates to standards. Let's go ahead and jump into our core topic today, which is going to be the IICRC's S500 and how we convert this document into standard operating procedures for our water mitigation businesses. So let me kick it off with this. First of all, the ANSI standards are written in a very, very specific way. The language is very purposeful. The key words that are used in the document all have a very specific meaning. And one of the challenges that I see that we run into frequently, at least, it's not necessarily universal, but it's frequent, is not necessarily understanding some of the key terms that are used in the document and what they really mean and what they really represent. Right in the front of the document, there are 5 key terms that are defined. They're called important definitions. And these are what we refer to as trigger words. And here's what they represent. When there is a practice or a procedure or a method that's being discussed in the document, the importance of that method and how critical it is that we adhere to that exact method is really defined by what word is included in that statement. Is it a shall, should, recommended, may, or can? And one of the very first things you need to do as a professional in this industry using the S500 for any purpose, whether it be developing standard operating procedures or using the document to justify a decision that was made in the field or as a training tool, however you're using it, you have to understand the intent and definition behind these 5 words. So I'm going to start with that because this is going to be a key part of using the S500 to standardize procedures, is that we first need to understand, are these procedures something that have to be standardized, right, into the way that you operate? Starting off with the word shall. Now you can find these definitions on page 12 of your S500. So anybody who's got that out and you're kind of reading along and kind of earmarking and highlighting and putting little sticky notes in there, if you haven't been doing that to your S500, you should see mine. I think it's got more highlights and sticky notes than it does regular paper. First, the word shall. Shall is a trigger word that represents that the practice or procedure is either required by regulatory law or regulatory requirements, or it's a natural law, right? And therefore, when we see a practice, a procedure, a result, or anything else being communicated by the standard that contains the word shall, especially if it's a regulatory requirement, then it absolutely needs to be a part of our standard operating procedure. The only exception to that rule would be if that regulatory requirement relates to a jurisdiction that does not impact your area of business, all right? And there are some instances for that. Having said that, however, if it's a regulatory requirement in particular areas, not necessarily in your area, it's probably still a good idea to have it as a standard operating procedure. The next one down is should. Should means that the practice or procedure is a component of what we call the accepted standard of care. Now, I'm going to define standard of care for you here in just a moment. I'm not going to do it on this particular image, but for right now, just let me state that standard of care is what the document, the S500, sets out to communicate. That is what we call our standard of care. It's not state of the art, it's not best practice, it's standard of care. And I'll get into standard of care here in just a moment. But should, therefore, is quite important. Then we have the recommended, may, and can. And these all kind of fall into a similar category. They're not necessarily a component of the standard of care. However, they are still important, just not necessarily required. Generally, the document will use the term recommended when the practice or procedure is a method that has grown in industry acceptance, it's been recognized to produce a better outcome than other methods, and the consensus body is basically, in short, trying to drive that behavior within the industry because there is consensus that it does provide a better result. May is generally used when a practice or procedure is permissive. You may do something in a certain way, but it's not necessarily the only way. And it's not that this particular way is better than other ways. It's just a way that it can be achieved. So it's permissive, which can also be a very powerful statement, but not necessarily a part of the standard operating procedure. And then can, last but not least, as a trigger word, is really just a notification to the reader of a likely result. That's generally where can is used. So it's not really a standard operating procedure target. It's more of an awareness that if you do A, you can have B occur, right? It's generally going to be a cause and effect or a consequence of a particular action. Now, again, all of these terms are defined for you on page 12 of the S500. The other thing that I want to note here before I leave this image is that these terms are universal throughout all ANSI IICRC standards. It doesn't matter what standards you pick up, this page, these definitions, these terms are going to be identical, Okay, so this is a driving foundation for all of the standards that are developed by ANSI IICRC. So very good to be quite aware of them. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to drill into what we mean by standard of care. So this is that page in the S500 that discusses these important definitions, these important terms, these triggers. And you can see all these definitions here, but I want you to call your attention down to the very last paragraph on this page. And I want you to, in particular, draw your attention to this sentence down here. What is standard of care? And this is something that, personally, I've committed this to memory because of how important this is. And I would encourage you to do the same. The S500 Consensus Body Standard Committee interprets the standard of care to be, and this is where the important part starts, practices that are common to reasonably prudent members of the trade who are recognized in the industry as qualified and competent. This is a really critical phrase. It's like the mission statement for any volunteer on a standard writing body. This is what we're trying to document. This is what we're trying to memorialize within this standard. Now, state of the art and best practice and some of these other phrases that we commonly hear around standards are problematic. And that's the reason why the standard doesn't really pursue those types of procedures. Best practice can be much more expensive than what is reasonably prudent. Best practice can not necessarily have the infrastructure rather for you to replicate that across all projects. So if we required all contractors to always perform best practice, then restoration would cost 10 times more. And quite frankly, many cases you wouldn't have the resources to deploy that practice on every project because they just don't exist, right? So it's not really prudent for us to write a standard around best practice. It's not really prudent for us to write a practice around anything other than what is common among reasonably prudent members of the trade who are trained, they are qualified, they are competent, right? So that's what should represents. And that's the reason I wanted to highlight this. As you develop standard operating procedures for your business, especially as you use the S500 to establish what those standard operating procedures are, it's really important to zero in on the word should. And hopefully I've stood on that soapbox long enough and really driven that home, because when you read a document, most of us, if you're not familiar with how this is written, most of us read should to mean something else, right? I'll give you a great example. My kids are a wonderful example of this. If I ask, one of my kids that you really should do your homework, right? They're going to read that a lot differently than me saying you have to do your homework, right? Then just think about the difference that means to somebody who's not really familiar with the weight of the word should in one of these documents. Now, the reason the word should is used like that in these documents is because we're using it with its legal definition, right? And this paragraph and these terms, et cetera, these were all defined by attorneys based on the legal definition, which is just the unfortunate reality for how these documents have to be written, because ultimately that's the place where they may have to, stand to muster, right? So with that, that's the terminology that I wanted to establish and kind of the basis I want to establish as we get into the development of standard operating procedures. I just want to acknowledge, thank you, Colin, so much for being my first participant to throw a question in the Q&A. That is my reminder to everybody as we're going through this. Make sure that you drop those questions into the Q&A, and at the town hall session at the end, I'll make sure we hit on all of them. But Colin, because you're first in, I'm going to make sure I answer it now. So where can we find a copy of the S700? That's the fire standard for structure. The S700 is in draft, so it's not published yet. However, that draft is going back into public comment. So you'll be able to find it at IICRC.org, click on standards, go down to the S700, and as soon as it's back into public comment period, which should be sometime in the next week or so, you'll find a link there to download the draft. If it's not there right now, that means they haven't quite opened up the public comment period yet, but it's coming very, very quickly. So IICRC.org, click on standards, scroll down to S700, and that's where you'll find it, Colin. Thank you very much for that question and being for the first one to drop a question into the Q&A for me. All right, so with that, let's roll forward. All right, so the first place I want to start here in developing a standard operating procedure out of the S500 is to take a look rather at the table of contents. And what I've done is I've pared down the table of contents to those sections that are most relevant for transforming or transposing the content into standard operating procedures. And there are a handful of sections here that all are going to have some really good content for doing this. So let me just kind of highlight these here for you for just a moment. First is the principles section, and I'm actually going to drill into that one pretty deep today because that one's so critical. But principles it's a good high-level overview of all of the buckets of procedures that are critical to performing water damage mitigation properly. And it's the most distilled, simplified, remove the fluff language in the entire document for what really needs to be done. And it makes a great checklist. So I'm going to show you what that looks like here in just a moment. Another section that's got some good meat to it for standard operating procedures is equipment and tools. Even though it's a very short section, a lot of the information that is there is great for those people or personas in your business that need to have an understanding for what is really required when handling and using specific equipment and tools. Section 8 on safety and health is another absolute treasure trove for standard operating procedures because of how critical the topic is. There's, again, great source material here for some standard operating procedures. Administration has some great content, especially for your project managers, your division heads, and procedurally the way we have chain of custody of projects. There's some great content there for that particular user group in standard operating procedures. And then sections 10, 12, 14, and 16, I'm skipping over 11 on purpose, 10, 12, 14, and 16 are really great source material for your field technicians, which tends to be where my area of passion is. It's where my history is. So we'll spend a little bit of time drilling into today, 12 in particular, structural restoration, because that's really the heart of that restoration practice in the field. And I'll make another comment about that, by the way. If you're not real familiar with how the S500 is kind of put together, generally speaking, all of the sections are focused on one particular aspect of restoration, except for section 12. 12 basically draws on the rest of the document and assembles that document into a process, structural restoration. So you'll take the most important stuff out of 1, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, et cetera, and it all pours into section 12 and then walks through the process a bit more chronologically. And one of the things that I'm going to make as a suggestion, and I'll show you why in a bit, is that section 12 be one of the core sections that you use for standing up your standard operating procedures. Section 11 kind of stands out differently. Section 11 is limitations, complexities, complications, and conflicts. And really what Section 11 stands up for us is problem resolution. How do I resolve challenges and problems that occur through the life cycle of a project in a way that has the project at heart, first and foremost, but also protects for your risk exposure and liability. If you've never digested Section 11, LCCC for short, and really spend some time thinking through that, especially as a general manager, as a business owner, as a department head, and really thought about the implications for the structure of that section and how it walks you through that decision-making process for how to mitigate risk as it relates to a project and exposure, you're really missing out on an invaluable resource because it's a wonderful, wonderful section for that. Not necessarily something that everybody in the business has to fully digest, but those that really affect the way decisions are made on projects, especially at the project management level, really critical that you're familiar with Section 11. All right, so for today, with all of these mentioned, I'm going to give you two things. Number one, a suggestion that the process I'm about to show you for how we go through these and make standard operating procedures is a process that, especially at the department head and project management level, and then into your field techs and your field tech leads, this is a process that you're going to want to go through as a business to develop these standard operating procedures. I'm not going to give you all of the standard operating procedures here today. I'm going to give you two really, really good examples that'll give you a huge head start and the methodology that I've gone through for developing these. But then the homework assignment is the only way you can really make a standard operating procedure really a part of your business personality is to go through the effort that I'm going to show you as a business and develop those standard operating procedures in the way that I'm going to show you to do it. And that's when it really becomes a part of your business. I'm going to do that for section 1 because it's so critical, principles, and I'm going to do that for section 12. In particular, section 12.5, which is the drying section of section 12. So with all of that said, let's go ahead and dive in. Let's take a look at it. First of all, here is the principle section, section 1, right? So this is my S500 opened to section 1. I'm looking at all of the different principles that are outlined for me in section 1. And as I said earlier, the nice thing about this first section is it's almost like a table of contents, if you will, without page numbers, that highlights for you the most important messages out of all of the subsections that come later in the document, and really distills down to the most core of those principles and what's most important. Now, even in reading this, I want to highlight for you what is most important again about developing standard operating procedures. I'm going to take this section over here on cleaning, right over here. So just take a look at this 1.2.4.1, cleaning, and let's take a look at this content that's beneath this. Cleaning is the process of containing, removing, and properly disposing of unwanted substances from an environment or material. Well, that's not really a standard operating procedure, right? That's informative. That defines for me what cleaning is. What defines for me the standard operating procedure is the sentence or the process that contains my trigger word, right? And this is what I'm going to hunt for. When I'm going through a standard and I'm trying to develop out what are my standard operating procedures, what needs to be on my punch list that should be checked off, done, and marked as complete anytime that I am performing this process of water damage mitigation. I need to look for these statements that tell me what is standard of care. What is common among reasonably prudent members of the trade who are trained, qualified, and competent, right? Told you I had that memorized, right? Hopefully by the end of this webinar, you've got it memorized as well. But it's those sentences that contain this term, should, they're going to be most critical to that. Now add on top of that the shalls, right? Because those are regulatory requirements. But should is where the meat of these operating procedures are going to come from. Therefore, what really needs to be a component of my standard operating procedure is, and this sentence reads, restore should evaluate and clean materials within the work area as needed. Now, one of the things that I want to point out about this is that these procedures are chronological. In other words, I'm going to ensure that cleaning is completed and that we are in a clean state before the drying occurs. In principles, it doesn't straight out say clean then dry, but later in the document it will, because we spell out how these things happen procedurally in section 12, okay? So this gives me a really simple, critically important statement that can be a part of my standard operating procedure. Clean the affected materials as necessary before beginning the drying process, right? You'll notice that in my little punch list when we get to that a bit later. Now we can draw on that by taking a look through this particular section and really start to build this out. If we just simply start looking around in this section and ask ourselves, where are my should statements, right? My should statements are all going to set up the standard operating procedures because these are the standard operating, or these are the accepted components rather of the standard of care. And again, all you got to do is really peruse through here and look for the shoulds. Now notice this section, if you were to add up the word count in here, it's like, 150, 200 words, somewhere in the neighborhood, maybe 250 words that make up this section. If I distill all of those words down to just the should statements and simplify it, this is what it looks like. So this is me taking the principle section and distilling the principle section just down to those statements that are a part of my standard of care, right? And now I've got a punch list, right? Item number 1, the first principle, provide for safety and health, right? Prepare my appropriate personal protection equipment and inform building occupants about any safety hazards that are present. That comes right out of the language from principles. Then inspect the property, understand the moisture migration, evaluate the psychrometric conditions, determine the water source and the time of intrusion, right? And now I've got a punch list here of all of the things that are common among reasonably prudent members of the trade who are trained, qualified, and competent in the form of a punch list to ensure that I'm touching, all of these elements as it relates to the core principles of the restoration process. Now notice this got me all the way down to, and actually it was 823 words a total section in the standard. Apologize because there were more pages. But this got me down to about 80 words, 90 words, 100 words, somewhere in that neighborhood. It got me down to about 10% of the language that drills me right down to what is most critical and most important for me to act on. Now this, as a standard operating procedure, can be produced a couple of different ways, right? It can simply be put together as a punch list on a piece of paper that's in with the forms and we check the box. It can be integrated into digital applications that are used to manage your workflows, so we can ensure that we're checking off on particular elements as they're critical. And you can do it at different levels. I could just do it at the parent boxes, or I could do it at the demoted level one layer deeper to give my technicians a little more instruction and guidance on exactly which one of these elements in my standard operating procedure, what they look like and what the components of this are. Now let's take it a layer deeper. Okay, so that's section 1, and distilling section 1 down into my triggers and what is most important. Taking it a little bit deeper, I can divide that out into core buckets. All right, and this is kind of getting a little bit closer to a standard operating procedure. This is taking each of the core subjects that was in principles, which outlines the most important elements of a water damage mitigation process, and then making those kind of like my topic headers here. So safety and health is one critical bucket. Inspection is my next critical bucket, right? Once we go from safety and health. And then once we're through inspection, it's documentation and determinations. So kind of follow these left to right, then move down to the next row, left to right. Underneath each one of these, we have a little bit more detail, right? Under safety and health, it's assess the safety, inform and address safety issues, document. Now notice there's a little bit more meat on this, and I'm building out a little bit more meat on each one of these section headers. Here's the reason. I'll flip back to this in just a second, because as you dive deeper into the document and you read subsequent sections, each of these subsequent sections is going to start to add a little bit more meat. Here is section 12.5. Right, this is the drying section. And in the drying section of 12.5, which is under structural restoration, 12.5 is drying specifically, you can see that we have a lot more meat here. When I start to read through this and I scan for just my should statements and distill this down to just the should statements, I'll see if I can find one here as an example, right? So I've got this paragraph here on closed drying systems as an example. There's a whole lot of information in this paragraph, but when you scan the paragraph, how much of it is a should, right? How much of that is a trigger statement? There's not a lot there that is a should. Most of it is informative. Most of it technically could be used as a training document, right? The stuff that's necessary for my standard operating procedure are going to be those statements that say the restorer should. And what should the restorer do? What is the actual required component of the standard of care? I'm just going to underline this sentence so we can make a comparison here for how much of that sentence is really represented by that should, or how much of that paragraph. It's not a substantial amount. So take that and distill that down just like we did section 1, and I can take 2,862 words of the standard. That's section 12.5. That's a lot, right? So really lengthy article in a magazine, if you will, maybe even a little bit longer. And I can distill it down to these 200 words. Now take those 200 words, and again, now I'll scroll back to this little flow chart, and that's how we start building this out. We pull out from that the standard operating procedure statements, and we start putting them underneath our principles. Again, these 6 elements, or not 6 elements, these 9 elements are what were in my principles section. And all I'm doing now is I'm adding some additional content underneath each one of these to fill out what are my critical items for my standard operating procedure underneath each one of these core principles. And as you do that through section 12, that's where you're going to find the most meat, by the way, to hang underneath these is going to be in section 12, because that is, again, the structural restoration section, right? What's going to draw on the entirety of the book. So you start with section 1 principles, outline principles, you go to section 12. Section 12 has got a lot of the meat and potatoes as it relates to the procedures in the field, and we expand these little bullet points that are underneath here. So let's go back to section 12 again. And let's take a look at some of the stuff I extracted out of section 12. So this is 12.5. Again, this is the drying section. This is specific to what we do to actually dry a building. It carries over from some previous discussions in 12.1, 2, 3, and 4 that basically culminate in the development of a drying plan, among other things, and dealing with remediation and other things that are necessary prior to beginning the drying process. But it really gets into really expanding on implementing a drying plan and what that looks like. Control airflow, manage temperature, manage humidity, determine any additional dehumidification that is required, perform ongoing inspections and monitoring, and adjust the drying plan, right? Now, that's the logical kind of structure of 12.5. If you drill in a little bit deeper, notice how when we distill, again, just the should statements, how much more plainly this reads for us as an operating procedure. And we'll start off with controlling airflow. Determine, first of all, the cleanliness and add an air filtration device if there is concern present after cleaning. That's step number one, right? So as a technician in the field, as a part of my standard operating procedure, I'm going to determine whether or not cleanliness is an issue after my pre-cleaning. And if it is, I'm going to install an AFD. By the way, with each of these bullet points, I would highly encourage that there be some level of documentation about the decision that was made. Step number two, put one air mover for each affected room. And if it's larger than 25 square feet, add one for every 50 to 70 of floor, for every 100 to 150 of wet upper wall and ceiling, and one for every offset. And then step number three, airflow must be present over all wet affected surfaces. So check. Make sure that after that installation, every wet surface is covered. If not, add. Monitor and adjust within 24 hours. Now that's taking the entire section of 12.5.7, which is managing airflow, which is in and of itself a little over a page, I believe, of total content in the S500, and distilling that down to a single paragraph. The things that must be done, because they are common among reasonably prudent members of the trade, are all presented here as a simple checklist, right? And again, this is how we get a standard operating procedure out of the standard. When we back up and review the process, step number one, right, is to just identify the key trigger words, the word should being that most important term that you're going to look for in the standard. Pulling out just those phrases, those should phrases, and from those should phrases, developing your checklist. What are the items that must be completed? Let's go into the second example here of measuring temp or monitoring or managing temperature. Determine if materials or contents are heat sensitive. Set temperature goal to promote drying within limits of equipment and material tolerances. Okay, this is an important step, and as plain as this sounds and as simple as this sounds, think about how important this is as a part of your standard operating procedure. I need to understand, are the materials that are present that are heat sensitive? Do I have equipment that has temperature limits? Based on those two, what is my upper limit for my temperature, and set that as a temperature goal. Notice how all of that rolls up into your drying plan. All right, I'd also ask you to think for just a moment, how many of you set a drying plan in motion? The standard of care calls for establishing and implementing a drying plan. These are the components of your drying plan: control airflow, manage temperature, manage humidity. These are elements of your drying plan. I don't know how many of you have ever made the mistake of letting a temperature get a little out of control in a space where there were some temperature sensitive materials present, but that can be a very, very expensive mistake. Step number three here, manage humidity. Determine if outdoor air is usable. All right, depending on that determination, isolate outdoor air if it's not usable. Add dehumidification to supplement, even if it is usable, but it's not sufficient. Right, this is a really important determination. Because many of us get into kind of an automatic mode where we install a certain amount of dehumidification just because that's the amount of dehumidification needed based on evaporation in the space. If we overlook the usability of outdoor air, we're missing a tremendous opportunity. It is standard of care to consider the outdoor air and its usability. It is standard of care to isolate from that outdoor air. Spend resources ensuring it doesn't affect the building if it's not usable, right? So that's a really important process in our standard operating procedure. We need to make that determination and then make a decision based on that determination, then take action based on those decisions. And that's what a standard operating procedure is there to drive. Again, nothing on this image is here because it's just good information. All of this is here because there is a should or a shall that requires it from our standard. So if it's not a part of your standard operating procedure today, if it's not something that you think is being commonly done in the field today, these are all reasons why you need to go through this exercise and develop out a standard operating procedure like this. Going through the fourth one here, determining dehumidification needed. Document the factors used to determine quantity, class, volume, dehumidifier type. Adjust, once installed, adjust using psychrometry and other factors as needed. And then the third one, increase vapor pressure differential in class 4 as materials dry. What's interesting about this particular one as in the form of a standard operating procedure is that the S500 does not actually give us an exact method for sizing dehumidifiers to a project. All right, and I'll let that kind of sink in for a second because a lot of us think that it does, but it doesn't. There is an appendix in the back of the document that provides some examples for what that method can look like, right? And it's perfectly okay to use that as your method, right? But it's not actually a standard of care to use that method, right? What standard of care is to have a method, right? And that method needs to consider the items that I've listed: the class of water, which is your evaporation rate, the volume of air within the space, and the technology or type of dehumidification you're using. And oh, by the way, the managed humidity discussion from up above that as well, right? If you're using outdoor air, that's what standard of care. You have to consider all of those factors and use those factors to determine the amount of dehumidification required. There's an example in the back of the book if you want to use that example, but it's not necessarily standard of care to use that exact method. Once you've installed the dehumidification, what is absolutely standard of care, and I think something that is overlooked dramatically in our industry, is that we have to adjust that dehumidification based on your psychrometry and your moisture and your materials, how it's responding. If it's working and you're drying, wonderful. If it isn't drying, change something, right? You're probably familiar with the definition of the word insanity, but the word insanity means to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, right? Miraculously to occur. If what we've installed is not making that subfloor make progress, then don't expect it to make the subfloor make progress in the next 24 hours, right? We've got to change something. We had a great session, and technically speaking, by the way, on those adjustments last year. I think the final episode last year covered that quite well. And then the next bucket here, ongoing inspections and monitoring. Record temp, humidity conditions daily. Record moisture and materials daily. Use the same meter, make, and model. These are all good statements, right? These are all good statements. The daily is a should, although it is filtered by the word on average, which means there are reasons why you may do it less than daily or more than daily. Temperature, humidity, moisture, and materials are all an element of what needs to be captured. And it has to be the same meter, make, and model. In fact, the S500 recommends it's the same exact meter, but at a minimum, it should be the same meter, make, and model. Cannot determine progress if we're changing anything about the instruments that we're using. Now, again, the reason I go into so much detail on this is just to call out the kind of information that comes out of the standard when you just distill it down to these should statements, right? These are what are going to build that standard operating procedure for you. And then finally, last but not least, adjust the drying plan. It is a component of the standard of care that we make changes to the way in which our drying plan is being implemented when there is a lack of progress. If what we're doing, again, isn't working, we need to change it. And this is justification for changes, right? We start based on assumptions. Our assumptions are that A, B, C in the drying plan is going to work. We come back 24 hours later or less. We observe what is working and what isn't. We change what isn't. We document what isn't. And we document the reason why we've made that change to substantiate and support that additional dehumidification, that additional air movement, that demolition of a building material because of excessive layers or whatever the decision was based upon. That becomes the basis for justifying the decision that we have made, okay? So there's a couple of really good examples drawing from what I think are some of the more meaty sections of the S500 for building up and standing up a standard operating procedure. What I want to kind of wrap that part of the conversation up with, again, back to our table of contents here. Let's take a look at that one more time. Again, these are the sections that I recommend that you break out as a business and look at for developing these standard operating procedures. And if anybody wants a list of the ones that I've already extracted from the examples today, this is the way in which I try to get some of you to reach out to me by email. You'll notice my email at the end of the document or the end of the presentation today when we're in Q&A. Send me an email and I'll send you copies of those that I've already extracted from those couple of sections that we've covered today. They can kind of give you a good kind of guiding light for how to find and extract that language. So I've included the page numbers that I've pulled those from the standard. But here's where I want you to focus. Again, focus on principles. I showed you the reason why there. It gives you the really good labels for the containers, right? Because these are the core areas that the document focuses on. It also gives you the most important statements underneath each of those containers. You know, again, they're principles, right? And they're there for a reason. Next layer, depending really on your role in the business, how you want to divide this up based on different types of roles within your organization. You'll then want to focus on, from a technical perspective, especially for those that are operating in the field, Some really good technical sections are going to be section 10, inspections, 12, structural restoration, 14, contents, again, depending on your specialty, and then 16, materials and assemblies. Those are going to be really good field-related standard operating procedures. For those that are more based in management of the projects overall, section 9 is going to be a really core section for you in and around administration. And into section 10, because generally those that are managing that process, depends on how you've got your business set up, but a lot of cases that project management level is also that core initial inspection level. And if that's the case, 9 and 10 are probably going to go to that same role or type. Section 11 is going to be more your department head and project management head level. Potentially even your technician lead level, depending again on how your business is structured. But this is really going to get into risk management and mitigating any exposure and liability you have as a business. So those are just some core areas of focus. Section 8 is probably good universally for anybody who is ever going to be on site in a project, but that's kind of my core areas of focus. It's not to say that it's not a good idea to also go into the other sections of the document, but what I'll tell you is this, is that by the time you're done, especially with section 1 and section 12, you're probably going to have 95% of things covered. The other 5% are probably going to come mostly from administration and LCCC. That's where the other 5% most likely are going to come from. The rest of the document is probably going to reinforce. By the time you finish that, the rest of the document is probably going to reinforce what you've already documented. Okay. All right. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and flip out here to some closing thoughts, and then we're going to get ready to get into the Q&A session. As I get into some closing thoughts here, here's my reminder for you. If you have not done so already, please make sure that any questions you've had today, you drop into the chat for me, or not the chat, but the Q&A tool. It looks like we've got quite a few to get us started here. So thank you to Harry, to Josh, to Kenneth, to Bill. I see the questions here that are all pouring into that area, and we'll address those here in just a moment. Eric, several from Anonymous. So we'll get to those here in just a moment. If you're with me live, right? If you watch this as a recording, unfortunately, you're going to miss the Q&A. Let me wrap up with this. Here's what's coming next. September 19th, I've got a wonderful guest that I'm bringing in, a gentleman named David Oakes. David and I spent a number of years training together under Restoration Sciences Academy with Legend Brands. He is a WRT instructor. He is a fire instructor. He does instructing and training in the worlds of cleaning and trauma and restoration in that space. He even does a lot of training and technical work in and around remediation. Great guy. He's going to join me on September 19th, and we're going to address the topic of trauma and crime scene cleanup. All right. So if that's an area of specialty for you, and you want to get a little bit from a really authoritative source with David, he is the chair of the Trauma and Crime Scene Cleanup Standard from ANSI and IICRC. So he chairs that consensus body. And he's also just a really well-spoken guy, really humble, but at the same time, very confident in that subject area. And I think you'll really enjoy David if you haven't had a chance to meet him. So September 19th, same time, 10 o'clock Pacific, right here on Technically Speaking. That's what we're going to touch on next month. Some other topics that are coming up a bit later in the year. I'm going to touch some more on commercial water damage a bit later this year. We had Mickey Lee on earlier this year, and he really helped us get into kind of the the business case and logistics as it relates to responding to commercial water damage. I'm putting a session together later this year that'll get more into the technical on that. We are going to bring in some more discussion in and around remediation. I've got a couple of folks that I work with in that space that I'm considering bringing in. And Trauma and Crime Scene is already on there. Plus, we'll have some water damage topics, of course. At least every other month will be specific to water damage mitigation. Last thing I want to note here is, if it's not already on your calendar, January 21st through the 24th in Austin, Texas, is Interconnect, Building Tomorrow Together. If you haven't registered for Interconnect, the really neat thing about Interconnect is it is an event that's really centered around training, unlike most industry events. And there is training designed specifically for every persona within your organization, all the way from the technician level training through to project management training, your sales and marketing groups, there's training there for them. And we actually break everything out into tracks so that as a company, everybody comes together getting training in their specific areas, but that all of that training is coordinated to come together to help your business overall, because that training is developed in such a way that that is consistent across all of those user personas rather. So if you haven't taken a look at that, take a look. You can go to corelogic.com and get more information about Interconnect. All right, so with that, that is my commercial for today. With that, I'm going to say thank you again very much for joining me here on Technically Speaking, Season 2, Episode 8. We will see you on Episode 9 with Trauma and Crime Scene Cleanup. See you next month.